He could close billion-dollar deals with a single phone call. He could move markets, rework leases, redraw skylines. He could command 1,000 voices in a room and have them fall silent the moment he spoke. But at a table lit by soft amber and the quiet clatter of cutlery, Marcus Whitfield found himself powerless in front of the one life that mattered most to him, his 8-year-old son, Jaime. The lobster on Jaime's plate sat untouched, the butter sauce glistening like a small, unreachable prize. Jaime rocked in his chair, fingers tracing the circular pattern of the linen napkin. The maitre d' kept his distance. The staff kept rehearsed smiles. Marcus clenched a jaw that had learned to hide anything softer than anger. Jaime listened to the hum of the restaurant the way he listened to everything, small, repeated patterns first, then the larger soundscape behind them. The chandelier ticked faintly, with a rhythm only he seemed to notice. Voices were awash. Forks made tight, metallic clicks. He smelled the lemon on his father's suit and the sour fear that hung there like steam. He liked the ring of the spoon on the glass, the way it made a sharp, comforting note he could count. He did not like being asked to open his mouth. She noticed it, not with the intrusive stare of someone who meant to own the moment, but with the careful attentiveness of someone trained to see patterns others dismissed as quirks. Kesha Williams saw the pull at Jaime's fingers, the way his gaze dropped to the edge of the plate and returned to the napkin, the small set of rituals that kept the day from spilling into chaos. She had learned to see like that at Riverside Learning Center, where she had spent years earning a master's in special education and then translating theory into patient, quiet practice, adjusting tone, matching rhythm, offering small, respectful invitations rather than commands. That program had been a lifeline for dozens of children. It had been cut when Whitfield Industries' budget review declared outside programs non-essential. Kesha was a waitress that Friday night, apron folded neatly at her waist, her hair pulled back in a practical knot. She worked 2 shifts most days to keep the bills paid. She had taught behavior plans and sensory strategies. She had written individualized goals for children who learned at different speeds and through different senses. She kept her credentials in her wallet like a talisman and her limits like a professional obligation. She knew the difference between helpful support and the world's hunger for a simple, marketable miracle. She also believed that dignity was the shape of the small acts people were willing to offer one another. Marcus watched Kesha approach with an impatience that had nothing to do with the service. It was an impatience he had learned to wear like armor against any discomfort that might suggest he was not in control. "Is there something wrong with the meal?" he asked, voice steady as any investor call. She looked at him briefly, then at Jaime, and something in him shifted because she did not see the billionaire. She saw the child. She knelt, not with the theatrical gentleness that demanded applause, but with a quiet steadiness that said, "I am here, and I will respect you." Her first words were not a diagnostic. They were a low hum, a thread of sound as familiar as breathing. Not a song he knew by name, but a tune altered into a quiet loop. It sliced thinly through the din of the room and landed on Jaime's shoulder like the first drop of rain on parched earth. Jaime paused. The hum held. He focused on the sound the way he focused on the spoon's ring. Sharp, countable, safe. She did not rush. She matched the rhythm of his small, repetitive motions with her own hands. No flashy miming, no exaggerated theatrics, only mirroring that validated his pattern rather than trying to stamp it out. When she offered him food, it was not from the plate across the table. She broke a tiny piece of lobster and extended it on her palm as one might offer a flower. The movement was open-palmed, non-threatening. Jaime stared, then sniffed, then reached with the deliberate slowness of a ritual. He took the morsel and, for the first time that evening, opened his mouth. The sound that came from Marcus was not a cheer. He did not raise a corporate fist. It was a breath that released 10 months of denial. He had been the one who signed the memo that diverted Whitfield Industries' special ed grant last year, citing strategic reallocation. He had argued at the boardroom table that the funds would yield a better return if invested into tech incubators and global expansion. He had not read the memo with the eyes that could see the ripple beneath the numbers, the classrooms, the aides, the storybooks left unread on small chairs. He knew the arguments, the metrics he'd been taught to value. He did not know how to be present when a child offered his first bite. After Jaime took that small piece of lobster from Kesha's hand, he made a sound, an odd, bright noise that was not a word but carried the shape of one. Kesha smiled with a tenderness that did not flatten into heroism. Marcus felt himself carried forward and undone by the simplicity of it. He wanted to ask how she did it. Instead, all he could manage was, "Thank you." She only said, "He's been working hard," the professional notation in her voice that hinted at what she had observed and the work she understood. She did not accept the kind of fuss that turned a private moment into a public spectacle. She would not become the narrative's white-hot center. 3 days earlier, Marcus had stepped out of an elevator on the 16th floor, the glass wall giving him a view of the East River, like a painting he could rearrange when it suited him. He had sat at the long walnut table and heard the finance projections in a voice that made his pulse do what his suits could not hide. He had signed the document that reallocated Whitfield Industries' charity portfolio. The budget lines were clean, the spreadsheets gleamed. The decision was lauded by analysts. The board praised his strategic focus. The last line in the meeting minutes read, "Funds redirected to accelerate growth initiatives." He told himself he had not done so to hurt anyone. He had done it because the company needed to compete, to survive. He had told himself the language of efficiency and scalability was the same language as care. He had not sat in a classroom on a Thursday at 3 o'clock to see a child's shoulders lift when a small thing finally made sense. Meanwhile, across town, Kesha had been closing out her shift at Riverside Learning Center, punching in and out as the kids cleared their lunch trays, as sensory bins were refilled, as teachers underwrote their own classroom supplies from their pockets. The notice came like a winter wind. Grant expired, donors shifting priorities, program unsustainable without outside funding. Kesha read the memo with the steady quiet of someone who had to become two things at once: fierce for the children she served and pragmatic about survival. She took work at a restaurant because rent wouldn't pay itself, because professional certificates don't buy groceries when the programs that relied on a company's philanthropy vanish. She taught, she waited, she loved, without spectacle. After the restaurant, the moment stayed private for a few hours, like a pocket of warmth. Then a diner's smartphone filmed the scene, and a clip leapt across feeds overnight. A wealthy child eating after a black waitress hums to him. Comments poured in like rain, some grateful, some resentful, some eager for a simple story to hold. The clip simplified the nuance into a caption that read, in effect, "Waitress performs miracle." It was not what had happened, but the economy of the internet demanded headlines. Margaret Sinclair saw the clip before Marcus did. She had filed for custody months earlier after she moved back into town, citing concerns about Jaime's care. Her lawyers had been sifting for leverage. Marcus had assumed the custody matter was a legal formality, a challenge he could outmaneuver as he did every competitor. He had underestimated how fragile certain judgments were once they entered the public sphere. The tabloid framing was merciless. It cast Kesha as both savior and villain, savior in the shorthand for compassionate action, villain in the racialized caricatures that always lurked under certain headlines. Reporters descended. Camera flashes blurred the edges of the family like a storm. Kesha found herself watched by people who did not want to understand her training. They wanted spectacle. Marcus felt something crack in him as his face was printed alongside simplified captions that told a story that was not true. For the first time, His public status felt like an accusation. Margaret's lawyers filed an amended custody petition, and the courtroom became a place where narratives would be contested. She argued that Marcus's neglect, evidenced by his inability to maintain stable care for Jaime, made him unfit. She argued that the man who had redirected funds that once supported programs like Riverside could not now claim to be the only one to decide Jaime's best interests. Her case did not need to be strictly true to be persuasive. It needed to look like the truth in sound bites and image. The air in the courthouse smelled like paper and polished wood, and a hunger to be proven right. For Kesha, the storm was terrifying and humiliating in equal measure. She had not asked for cameras. She had gone to work. She had performed a professional, ethical gesture that in her world was ordinary, to meet a child where he was, to reduce pressure, to invite participation through rhythm and choice. The clip that made her famous overnight stripped all the context, the degree, the days at Riverside, the hours reading and practicing techniques, and superimposed on her the strange halo the internet grants to people who embody a moment. She could have stayed quiet. She could have let the narrative ride its course. She also knew what silence might mean for children left without services, the programs closed, the aids gone. So she testified. She took the stand not as a spectacle, but as a professional called to witness. In court she wore a simple blouse, and her hair in the practical knot she favored when she would need to move quickly. She spoke plainly about what she had been trained to do, the nature of her master's program at Riverside, the structure of the classrooms she had helped run. She described without sensationalism how sensory supports and stable staff had been reduced after Whitfield Industries' budget shift. She described waiting lists lengthening, aides being let go. She spoke of the children, names left out for privacy, the small routines that kept them learning. Her testimony did not attempt to transform Jaime's condition into a simple parable. It named institutional decisions and their human consequences. When asked on cross-examination about the restaurant scene, she refused to let it be twisted into a claim of miracle. It was a breakthrough for one child in that moment, she said. Breakthroughs are meaningful. They are not prescriptions. The work we do is incremental and requires continuity. She leaned on her professional credibility. She offered a practice-oriented clarity that both protected the dignity of the child and highlighted the gaps left by policy decisions. Marcus sat at the defense table and felt the weight of every past choice like a physical hand on his chest. The steel logic he had relied on in conference rooms sounded hollow in the hush of the courtroom. He had expected that his wealth and reputation would be armor. Instead, both had become reasons a jury and a public might demand accountability. He could not unmake the memo he'd signed. He could not rewind the funding lines to restore a program overnight. But he could listen. And in listening, he found the edge of what redemption might begin to feel like. Outside the courtroom, the media wanted a simplified story. Wealthy man humbled by the kindness of a woman from a different world. That framing made for palatable narratives, but flattened the harder truth Kesha had laid bare on the stand. This was not about a single act of charity redeeming structural failure. It was about a pattern of choices that had orphaned services. It was about the responsibility of institutions, companies that call themselves stewards of communities, to act in ways that matched their public claims. It was about reparative action as policy, not as performative apology. Marcus was not a man who did apologies lightly. He had apologized in press releases before. Those were statements polished like coins. But the apology he owed now required more than a sentence. It required a change that would be visible in boardroom minutes and in the classroom rosters of Riverside Learning Center. He stayed awake at night and rehearsed words that would not thin the reality of the families who had lost services. He called Margaret, and the call ended with more silence than agreement. He called lawyers. They drafted statements. He called Kesha. When he asked to meet her, he did not realize how awkward it would feel to go from a place of power to a position of asking. He arrived in a modest coat, his tailoring less armor than an attempt at humility. Kesha agreed to meet in a quiet cafe near Riverside, a place where memory and work overlapped. She did not want to be paraded, but she believed in accountability. She had spent enough nights awake to know the difference between being thanked and being believed. They talked in honest, sometimes awkward turns. Marcus listened while Kesha described the Riverside classrooms, how aides used predictable routines so children could anticipate the day, how sensory corners let children decompress, how continuity of staff meant trust. She spoke of budgets and waiting lists and the way a private grant could extend life chances for a child who otherwise had no plan. She did not ask him to feel guilty. She asked him to be responsible. Marcus asked questions that surprised him, because they were not the questions of a man wanting to control, but the questions of someone wanting to understand enough to act better. How could corporate policy change? What would it take to reinstate funding? What systems should be implemented so programs did not hang on a single executive decision? Each question was small, but together they created the grammar of repair. He did not react with spectacle. He did not demand Kesha run the foundation he proposed on a pedestal. He proposed, humbly, to create a fund within Whitfield Industries devoted to neurodevelopmental services, to reinstate lines of funding, to stabilize Riverside and similar programs with multi-year commitments. He asked if she would help design it. Kesha hesitated. She understood the moral hazard of trading professional labor for praise. But she also understood the possible power of institutional change that meant fewer children would find themselves waiting lists deep, staff cut, learning shuttered. A legal settlement eased the immediate custody crisis. Marcus agreed to shared custody while committing to a formal family plan approved by pediatricians and educators. The custody suit did not end with a dramatic courtroom declaration of villain and hero. It ended with a negotiated agreement that placed Jaime's needs where they should have been all along, at the center. Margaret left the public fight with her own bruises. Her anger had been a political calculation as much as a maternal concern. The tabloids moved on to other spectacles. The people affected by the funding cut were not erased by headlines. Whitfield Industries announced a foundation, modest and carefully defined, the Marcus Whitfield Neurodevelopmental Support Fund. The language in the press release was plain and procedural, designed to avoid theatrics. The fund offered secured multi-year grants to community centers and created an advisory board that included educators from Riverside. Kesha accepted an offer to be the foundation's director of community initiatives, her title formal, her pay fair, her professional boundaries respected. She also insisted on a governance structure that prevented the foundation from being merely a PR bandage. She demanded long-term commitments, quarterly audits with community representation, and staff hiring practices that prioritize local trust. Marcus did not purchase Kesha out of guilt. He paid her because she had earned the role through training and work, and because she had the judgment he did not possess. That choice mattered. It signaled a shift from the performative to the substantive. It meant banning the language of one-time miracle and replacing it with plans that involved people who knew the work intimately. At home, change looked like small, stubborn habits. He did not learn to be a perfect father. He learned to lower his phone during dinner. He learned to hum, not as a gimmick, but as a shared routine that introduced predictability into noisy moments. He learned to allow Jaime time to touch the rim of his glass and the way the water shifted. He practiced patience, the way an investor might practice restraint, deliberately and with measurement. He read the memos Kesha recommended, attended therapy sessions, and learned to ask with a real desire to know, instead of with a demand to be obeyed. Jaime did not become a different child overnight. He continued to have days when noise overwhelmed him, when the world felt too sharp. He also had days when he chose to sit at the table and let someone else break the crust of a roll, offering a small victory that no press release could properly honor. He began to participate in a program at Riverside, funded by the new foundation, surrounded by staff who knew the value of his rituals, who offered structure as a scaffold rather than as a cage. He learned new rhythms at his pace. In the margins of his life, his drawings grew more complex. First a row of circles, then a house, then two figures holding hands under a crude, comforting sky. Kesha kept her professional limits. She insisted on classroom hours and staffing ratios that respected teachers' time. She refused to be framed as a single savior. She spent her days designing programs, advocating at board meetings, and standing with families who bore the weight of bureaucratic indifference. She visited Jaime's classroom and sometimes sat in the back as an observer, not to direct but to support. She taught staff how to advocate for continuity, how to include parents in plans, and how to resist the urge to view each success as a soundbite. She became an accountable steward of the resources she had once begged for. There were missteps. Not every donation was used perfectly. For every family the fund helped, another bureaucratic form created waits. Kesha confronted contractors who promised miracles in exchange for money. Marcus learned to recognize the language of spin and to question his own assumptions about what help looked like. He learned that apology without action was not apology at all. In public, Marcus offered a statement that was less than some demanded and more than he would once have managed. He acknowledged Whitfield Industries' prior funding decisions and accepted responsibility for the consequences. He did not plead for forgiveness in a way that absolved systems. He pledged to build better ones. He did not allow the conversation to turn into a rerun of spectacle. He gave concrete figures, multi-year commitments, staff salaries indexed against inflation, oversight that included community voices. Kesha's testimony in court remained a fulcrum in the public imagination because it had been more than a moment. It had been a call to accountability. When people asked if one humming session had rewritten Jaime's trajectory, she answered plainly, "Breakthroughs happen, they are not cures." What made the difference here was continuity, funding that allowed a child to continue learning without interruption, staff with the capacity to support him when a moment of connection transformed into a pathway forward. That gaze, the one that sees the routine work as sacred, was what moved Marcus. It was not a magic trick. It was the slow work of writing a ledger that had long measured only profits. The foundation did not erase systemic inequalities. It tried, in small ways, to repair what corporate choices had frayed. It funded community outreach programs that recruited and trained local staff, provided stipends that kept aides from needing to hold second jobs, and created sensory rooms in centers where waiting lists had been the rule until then. Kesha oversaw the allocation with an attentiveness that made the boardroom nervous at first. She required reports in plain language and meetings where parents could speak without lawyers translating their words. Marcus sat in those meetings as a learner, asking concrete questions, sometimes fumbling, sometimes embarrassed, but present. The custody agreement evolved into a parenting plan that centered Jaime's routine needs, rather than the older model of split weekends and legalities divorced from care. Margaret, whose anger had been sharpened by the legal fight, saw the funding commitments as both repentance and public gesture. She remained guarded, but willing to test the new arrangements. The family learned to schedule time around sensory needs, to reserve quiet Sundays for low-stimulation activities, to respect the small rituals that made Jaime feel safe. There were small, symbolic acts that mattered in ways that documents never could. Marcus learned to let Jaime draw in his office when the day demanded it. He would step away from a negotiation to go to a parent-teacher conference. He would sit in a classroom and hum a tune, sometimes clumsy, sometimes honest, in the same minor key that Kesha had used in the restaurant. The sound did not fix everything. It built a bridge. Jaime's drawings filled with stars. One evening, he sketched a family under a night sky, 2 small stick figures and 1 larger, careful figure with a tie. The jagged strokes of the stars looked familiar. They were the same stars that would later find a plaque at Riverside, the Marcus Whitfield Neurodevelopmental Support Fund dedication, engraved with the names of the educators who fought to keep their classrooms intact. The plaque did not say miracle. It said commitment. It included Kesha's name, among those acknowledged, not as a saint but as a professional who had helped design structures so more children might be seen. Marcus's view of life changed in modest, concrete ways. He began to measure success not only by quarterly gains, but by the number of uninterrupted school days a child enjoyed. He put a clause in board governance that required community representation on charitable grant committees. He attended training sessions where the language of sensory needs was explained plain and practical. He learned to be embarrassed and to let that embarrassment be the start of better questions rather than the end of conversation. He apologized publicly and privately to families who had been affected by prior cuts. He sent handwritten notes to teachers he had once dismissed. Kesha continued to do the day-to-day work she had always done, building programs, supporting families, insisting on standards. She refused to be a mascot for headlines. She trained staff to document progress without turning children's lives into content. She set up scholarships for paraprofessionals and advocated for living wages for aides. She negotiated with legal counsel to make sure the Foundation's funds could not be diverted to flashy, short-term projects. She kept her apron folded in a drawer at home as a reminder of the hours she had spent with her own hands doing work that never wanted attention. Public opinion shifted slowly. Some criticized the Foundation as too little, an attempt at reputation management. Others believed it was the beginning of something real. Kesha listened to both and did not pretend to resolve either in a press release. She went back to classrooms and met parents whose relief was measurable not in headlines, but in the fact that their children now had a stable place to learn. She met aides who no longer had to choose between a second job and a consistent presence for students. Those were the metrics she trusted. Years later, on a warm evening with the windows open to the smell of summer, Marcus sat with Jaime at a small table. Jaime's hand was steady now as he drew, a small fleet of stars hovering above a scribbled house. Marcus hummed, sometimes off-key, and Jaime paused to listen. Then he added tiny dots around the stars, as if filling in a sky. Kesha had visited that day and watched from the doorway, not imposing, just there like the steady architecture of a community that had been rebuilt. She smiled and left the two of them to the small, ordinary business of being a family. The final image was quiet and private. Jaime's paper taped to the kitchen door, labeled in a child's print, family. The stars were a crowded cluster now, and the figures beneath them held hands. Marcus kissed his son's forehead, a simple act that could not erase the years of absence or the corporate choices that had harmed others, but that held the promise of daily repair. He had learned that love was a labor of attention, of presence, of small shifts repeated until habit formed. If this story resonates, if it leaves you thinking about who gets seen and who is allowed to be invisible, share it so more people consider the cost of looking away. Systems hurt in ways a headline cannot fully measure, and repair begins when institutions take responsibility and when individuals are willing to learn. Kesha still hummed the same tune sometimes. She sometimes offered a handout, not to fix but to invite. Marcus continued to sign checks that mattered, but he also signed attendance sheets and phone logs and therapy schedules. Jaime's drawings multiplied on the fridge, stars, houses, people with tied figures, who sometimes hummed in imperfect harmony. The plaque at Riverside gleamed softly in afternoon light, a modest promise etched into metal, commitment in place of neglect, resources in place of rhetoric. What had changed was not a single act of salvific remedy. It was a reorientation through attention. Marcus's view of life shifted from an axis of control to one that included humility and responsibility. His relationship with Jaime transformed from distant custody to daily care. Kesha's professional steadiness turned a moment into a movement of accountability. The world remained complicated. Funding lines still shifted and headlines still raced. But in classrooms and on kitchen doors and in steadier board policies, small acts of dignity and the demand for institutional accountability produced a new measure of value. On a clear night, Jaime would sometimes take a crayon and draw the family under a sky he had begun to recognize. And in that quiet, Marcus learned to see what mattered, not because someone taught him a trick, but because someone had the courage to name the harm, to offer expertise, and to hold him accountable until he chose to act differently. Share this story if you believe every child deserves to be seen.